Hello everyone, this is Chandra Hoffman. A few weeks ago I presented a live stream on Facebook on the Donner Party on the Auglaize County, Ohio Historical Society Facebook page. And that's still available for viewing in case you missed it. You can look for it under videos. But 2 years before that trip, I took a trip following the Oregon Trail. And I have given this presentation periodically in the community, so if you've seen it before, I've changed it up a little bit and added some photos. The Oregon and California Trail were the same until they got to either southwestern Wyoming or more frequently into Idaho. So if you watched my Donner Party live stream, some of the photos will be the same, but there'll be many new photos as well. And today I'll be focusing on telling the story of the Western immigration on the Oregon Trail. So I also recommend clicking on the little square in the lower right so that you can view it full screen. Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can was the advice of 13-year-old Virginia Reed of the ill-fated Donner Reed Party. As I said, the California and Oregon Trail was the same much of the way. So we're going to take her advice. It's a very long trail of about 2,200 miles. This is probably 1/16 of the total photos of my trip. I first became interested in the Oregon Trail when I read Women's Diaries of the Westward Journey by Lillian Schlissel. And this really opened my eyes to what the Western immigration really was like. You know, I'm of a certain age. I used to watch Wagon Train, and that was my idea of what the Western immigration was like. And this book made it clear that it was very different from that. The Western immigration was second only to the Civil War in the number of 19th century personal accounts that were written. Men and women both wrote diaries, but they were often very different. Men had difficult work to do on the road or on the trail, but it was different from their daily work of farming, and their diaries often tell of brave new adventures. Women had all the everyday things to do that they had to do at home. They had to do them on the trail, and they had to keep moving, and this included pregnancy and childbirth. Theirs often told more personal stories, such as caring for children and the elderly, childbirth, sickness, accidents, death, and encounters with Native Americans. I also have the 10-book series Covered Wagon Women. Each book in the series has diaries from a certain period of years. There also is the Best of Covered Wagon Women, which is, I guess, the best diaries in one book. So when I first, I always, ever since I read Women's Diaries of the Westward Journey, I wanted to take the trip following the Oregon Trail. And when my sister and brother-in-law said that they would go with me because my husband was still working, I started to investigate how to follow the Oregon Trail because I didn't even know what there was to see or if you could see anything. And then soon I found that the National Park Service has auto tour guides for all the historic trails for each state, or sometimes two states are put together. These books are an excellent reference, and I couldn't have made the trip without them. Each of the guides has a really good history of the trail in that state, gives thumbnail photographs of the places you can see. There's so many places in each state that you can see. It tells you directions on how to get there, and also if it's a museum or whatever, the hours that they're open, etc. Was one that was used for years by Native Americans, fur trappers, and traders. And today, modern highways overlie or parallel much of this route. Keep in mind that there were other cutoffs from this route that were used as years went on. The trail follows rivers whenever possible for obvious reasons. The first wagon train was organized in 1836 and included Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spaulding, who went with their husbands as missionaries. The first white women, so they were the first white women who journeyed on the Oregon Trail, and this really opened the door to other families considering making this trip. In the early years, they left from Independence, Missouri, which is where we left from, and then later there were also other jumping off places such as St. Joseph's, Missouri, and Council Bluffs, Iowa. The Mormons were also on this trail, and they left out of Iowa and then headed west and met up with the trail. They typically traveled 12 to 15 miles a day, and it took them 4 to 6 months to travel the 2,200 miles. The primary years of the trail were from 1843 to 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And even after that, people continued to take the trail even up to the turn of the century. It's estimated that 500,000 people followed this route. The peak years when the most people were on the trail were 1849 to 1852, and that's because of the California Gold Rush. So why did they go? Well, first there was a recession from 1837 to the mid-1840s. A lot of people went bankrupt. They lost their farmland. They heard these accounts from fur trappers, traders, and missionaries, the reports of this lush farmland. But mostly they were encouraged by the U.S. government to go by being given free land. So it differed at different periods of time, but at one period of time, a couple could get 640 acres, and a single person could get 320 acres. A single woman could not claim land, but a widow could claim land. Some went for religious reasons, such as missionaries, and other people went reluctantly, because other family members were going. Guidebooks and maps were published. Societies were formed to encourage immigration. There was this whole idea of manifest destiny. Prior to 1846, the U.S. government really was encouraging settlers to go to Oregon Territory because it was jointly occupied by Britain and the U.S., and this was in dispute. So the United States wanted citizens to go there so they had a better chance of claiming this. But it's palpable homicide to tempt or send women and children over this 1,000 miles of precipice and volcanic sterility, said Horace Greeley in 1843. As well, attempt to march an army to the moon as to march one overland to Oregon was an opinion in 1846. So we began our trip at the National Frontier Trails Museum in Independence, Missouri. This is a really nice little museum that especially focuses on preparations for the journey, because that's what was happening in Independence. According to the National Park Service, it would cost between $22,000 and $33,000 in today's money to obtain provisions for the journey. There was a man named Rinker Buck. Several years ago, he took the Oregon Trail in a wagon with his brother, and he wrote a book about it. It's hilarious. And they spent $25,000. So they gathered their supplies and they left in the spring to make it before the snow was in the mountains. If they used oxen to pull their wagon, they were cheaper, stronger, tougher. They could pull the wagons up out of ravines and out of mud holes. They were more reliable. They would eat poor grass, and they were less likely to run off or be stolen by the Native Americans. But oxen are slower, and you had to pull them. You can't drive them from the wagon because they're cattle. Mules were more expensive, but they were faster. They were sure-footed up and down the climbs. They could be driven from the wagon, but they took longer to hook up and unhook. And you hear the saying, stubborn as a mule, and that's because they won't do anything they consider as unsafe. So they're easily spooked or might refuse to budge. They took horses with them, but horses did not pull the wagons. They rode horses and they drove horses, and then they drove other cattle and sometimes some other animals as well. When I mentioned states, there were no states west of Missouri until later. California became a state in 1850, Oregon in 1859, and all the rest of the states in between, it was much later before they became states. So let's get started. I'm going to show you the sights, and by the way, you're probably walking because your wagon is full of stuff. So unless you're very old or very young, you are walking. So we started our journey right near the National Frontier Trails Museum. Osage Avenue, we were told, was the route of the Oregon Trail. So there are lots of roads in Independence and Kansas City that were the Oregon Trail. Obviously been paved over. Here in Santa Fe Park, we saw some swales here. They weren't that great of a set of swales, but they were here. Really nice set of swales in Kansas City. This is right in town. This is the Santa Fe, Oregon, and California Trail. So the Oregon and California Trail began following the Santa Fe Trail, and then the Santa Fe soon heads southeast, or southwest, sorry, to Santa Fe. That was a commerce trail. So here on the right, you see some swales, and I use ruts and swales kind of interchangeably, but you think of ruts as being the marks left by the wagons in the earth. But it wasn't like driving a car where you just got wheels making the indentations. You've got the wagon wheels, but you've got the animals pulling the wagon, you've got horses being driven and ridden, and you've got cattle being driven, and you have people walking. So often you see swales. These are minor park swales in Kansas City, little indentations there. And then throughout Independence in Kansas City, roads are marked because they were the Oregon Trail. Much of it in Kansas City is the Blue Ridge Parkway. They followed the Blue River from Independence into Kansas. Kansas was pretty much wilderness at the time. They often spent their first night at Lone Elm Campground, and I read that it was called Lone Elm because they cut down the wood for firewood, and then eventually there was just a lone elm left. So there is a lone elm there today, obviously not the original lone elm. They crossed the Kaw River, now the Kansas River. This was and is a rapid and wide river, and the Native Americans often would help them cross this. 100 miles out of Independence on the Oregon Trail Road, we came to Bellevue, Kansas, and here a man named Louis View, a Potawatomi Indian, established a toll bridge on the Red Vermilion Creek. He charged $1 a wagon and made up to $300 a day, which, you know, even today, in today's money is a lot of money. There you can see a historical marker and his cemetery. His grave is the large stone there. In 1849, a large wagon train was camped on the east side of the creek. It was struck with cholera, and it left more than 50 people dead within the week. So there is a cholera cemetery there. There's 2 stones. Most of the time, graves on the Oregon Trail were not marked. They didn't have time to stop and mark graves, and often they didn't have materials. The Oregon Trail is America's longest graveyard. In the 25-year main period of its use, it's estimated that 65,000 people died. If the graves were evenly spread out, there would be a grave every 50 yards. A cholera victim could be healthy in the morning and dead by afternoon. So this was way more deadly than COVID-19. Without treatment, which there was no treatment back there, it had a 50 to 60% mortality rate. Sometimes 2/3 of a train could be wiped out. People lost their spouses. They lost their children. Children were orphaned and had to be taken in by other families. Approximately 1 in 10 people did not survive the journey, and illness was the #1 reason. The heart has 1,000 misgivings, and the mind is tortured with anxiety, and often as I passed the fresh-made graves, I've glanced at the sideboards of the wagons, not knowing how soon it would serve as a coffin for some of us. Lucy Cook, 1852. This is on the interpretive panel next to the creek, so this illustrates how death was always on their mind as they. So here's the creek. This was described as swift back in the day. I was there twice, once following the Oregon Trail and then the Donner Party. The first time I was there during a drought when this photo was taken. The second time I was there when the area was flooded. Both times this is what the creek looked like. Water is not the same as it was back in the day. There's a lot of water being used for irrigation, so you can't really judge it based on what you see today. Prior to 1849, or if you couldn't afford the toll, the wagon would be lowered with ropes and then up the other side, and then you would drive your livestock down and up the banks. It might take a large train up to 2 days to cross. Scott Spring was another popular campsite because there was a spring there. Trains typically had 10 to 100 wagons, and there were less wagons in the trains as the years went on because they realized that fewer wagons allowed for more grass and water for the animals. They would circle the wagons at night to corral the most important animals. So especially in the early years, there really was no need for protection. And this was kind of a surprise often to the immigrants. They thought that they were going to need to be protected more than they were. It did change over the years. So people, as I said, their wagon was full of stuff, so they often slept under the tent, under the wagon, or they slept in tents. So some people did sleep in the tents, but there was a lot of stuff in there. Here where they're stopping to camp, they are burying their dead. And there's a sign about a child's grave and some cholera graves in the area. And then also on the left it says, "Here lies an early traveler who lost his life in quest of riches of the West." What's really fun about the National Park Service auto tour guides is that it's kind of like a scavenger hunt. So we were traveling on this highway. This is Highway 99 in Kansas. It's also called Return to Oz Highway. And then we got off on a dirt road. We were on a lot of dirt roads on our trip. And we were told to look for a gate. So we were looking for a gate much bigger than this gate. We actually passed this gate by and then figured we must have passed it, so we backed up. And here we saw the gate. So the directions were you could go into this private property, but make sure you lock the gate because this is an active cow pasture, which we could tell that it was. So we headed over to the set of trees. And here in the trees, we saw the lower crossing of the Big Blue River. So this was a very rapid and wide river. Here are swales coming up the hill, and at the top in the woods there you could see an interpretive panel. This is what the picture was on the panel. You could see what it looked like with the wagons crossing the river and coming up the hill. And then it also showed us a map of where we were and how far we still had to go. You can see in red all the little extra cutoffs. So then we headed over towards Alcove Spring. This is a picture I took just to kind of show you what the terrain looks like, just gently rolling hills here in eastern Kansas. To Alcove Spring, this was another popular campsite. I like how the picture said we had, or the sign said we had 1,853 miles still to go to Oregon City, and we've come 179 miles. So we parked our car and hiked through the woods to find the spring. Here was the interpretive panel showing what it would have looked like back in the day. The second time we were there during the flood, this fields next to the Blue River were flooded, just like when the Donners were there. So this is a field, not the Blue River. And this is what the little waterfall looked like both times we were there, during a drought and during a flood. Neither time did I see any water coming over the rocks there, like in the interpretive panel picture. Again, water has been diverted since that time. Water is used a lot for irrigation, so it's not the same as it used to be. Here at Alcove Spring, a member of the Donner Party named it Alcove Spring and carved that in a rock. And James Reed, one of the organizers of the Donner Party, also known as the Donner-Reed Party, carved his name and the date 26 May 1846 in a rock as well. We came to Hollenberg Pony Express Station. This was built in 1857 as a way station for the immigrants. This is an original building. In 1860, it became a Pony Express station. The Pony Express only lasted 19 months. So even though you hear so much about it, it really didn't last that long. And then later, this was also a stage station. We crossed into southern Nebraska, came to Rock Creek Station State Park. This is best known as where Wild Bill Hickok gunned down 3 men. So here on the large picture, you can see the little stone building that was a post office. And then on the left, you can see the inside of a Pony Express bunk. So this is the other side of the creek. Here you can see the barns and the Pony Express bunks, the wagons heading to. And then this is the creek that they had to cross. A toll bridge was built here in 1859. This toll bridge only cost 10 to 50 cents to cross, and the toll was based on your load size and your ability to pay. So if you didn't want to pay, or prior to 1859, you would have to lower your wagon with. This is where they said most people crossed. The trees obviously were probably not there at the time. So it's not a large creek, but you know, it's just kind of a hassle to cross that with wagons. And then wagons would come up the hill here. You can see the swales, the indentation at the top of the hill. And these, we were told, were wagon swales that have been undisturbed for over 150 years. So you can see how pretty the prairie was here. When I was a kid, the cowboy and Indian shows were popular, and the Indians were usually considered dangerous. So in the early years, most of the encounters with Native Americans were peaceful. And the Native Americans were often helpful. They helped them ford rivers. They traded supplies with them. But as Eastern tribes were relocated west where other tribes already were, so, you know, when tribes were taken from Ohio, Indiana, and they were sent out west, it's not like there weren't tribes there. There already were tribes there. And then more and more immigrants crossed our land. They brought disease. They helped themselves to game, grass, water, and wood. And so tensions really built over the years. And this area, Warpath on the Little Blue in southern Nebraska, is an area where the National Park Service points out where many attacks and ambushes took place in this area. Again, this is on the Oregon Trail. The sign up at the top left describes how the 1860s was a time when a lot of these attacks took place because a lot of the regular troops were withdrawn from the plains in order to fight in the Civil War. Fort Kearny, this was built in 1848. This was the first Western military post built to protect and supply the immigrants. So prior to 1848, this was a camping area and a trading post. The trail followed the Platte River for 500 miles from Fort Kearny west to Casper, Wyoming. So it was called the Great Platte River Road. When the wagons were traveling, they wouldn't follow each other in a line if they didn't have to because it was just so dusty. So they might spread out. Both times I've been there, I've taken the trail. It's been in August. It was hot. I had shorts on. Spent a lot of time walking on dirt roads and walking through tall prairie grass. And I got bit up by a lot of things. Don't know what it was, but my legs would itch. And so I would scratch my legs, and then my fingernails were just like caked with dirt. And the inside of our vehicle, if we opened the door, would just be a cloud of dust. So they often wore rags over their faces, and the stuff in their wagon and their clothes and everything, it just had to be filthy. So the Platte River was called sometimes a mile wide. It could be raging after a storm. It was called too thick to drink and too thin to plow. It was a major source of cholera. They didn't know that cholera was spread by the water, and they followed this river for 500 miles. It also had quicksand in it, and fording rivers was always dangerous. Wagons tipped over, animals and people drowned. The man swam after the cattle, and coming back by some means got off his horse and sunk and was seen no more. He left a wife and 6 helpless children. My husband stood watching him. It's supposed that there was a suck at the bottom of the river. Elizabeth Smith, 1848. So after crossing the South Platte, the bottom photo on the left, you can see the line of trees. The South Platte is down there. They came to California Hill, and here they had to drive up 240 feet in elevation in a little more than a mile and a half. So I took my Hyundai Elantra up this unimproved dirt road here, beautiful with the sunflowers. There's lots of wild sunflowers in Nebraska and into Wyoming. And this was their first major climb. And up California Hill, you could see ruts, lots of ruts actually, and then eroded ruts here on the side. This is open rangeland and a cow pasture. After California Hill, they traveled 18 miles from the South Platte to the North Platte. And here you can see what the terrain looks like here. They crossed on ridges, and this is a photo at Ash Hollow State Park of the ridges at the top of the hills here. This is the ridges from, or the marks from the Oregon Trail. And it didn't really explain anywhere why they crossed on ridges, so I can only surmise that first of all, if you're up high on a hill, you can see where you're going, and second of all, there were less creeks and streams and rivers that you would have to cross, but they had to get up there and then sometime they had to come down. So here at Ash Hollow, they came down this hill here on the right called Windlass Hill, L-A-S-S. And this is a zoomed in photograph of it. It's actually much larger than it looks here in the picture, but I was zooming in on the ruts there coming down the hill. And then there also was a little wagon with interpretive panels and showed that this brake was how they would lock their wheels in place as they came down the hills. So we went up, there's a path you can go up. It's a little asphalt path. You can go up Windlass Hill. It's kind of a big climb here. These are eroded ruts as we went up, and then at the top there was an Oregon Trail marker by the state of Nebraska. This is the view at the top of the hill. It's beautiful up there. The second time I was there, I came within 1 foot of stepping on a rattlesnake. So when you're out west and you're walking, you need to look down, and when you stop, you can look out. So this is the top of Windlass Hill looking down towards my car. You can see it down there. And then over on the left, farther in the distance, where the trees are, that's where they would stop and rest. There was shade and there's a spring there. A lot of the diaries talk about all the different rock formations. So this is Courthouse and Jail rocks, and many of the rocks are named. And these are remarked about quite a bit in the diary. A little bit down the road is Chimney Rock. Chimney Rock, well, both of these could be seen in the distance for up to a day ahead of time. So Chimney Rock is owned by the Nebraska State Historical Society, and I'm taking this photograph from the museum that they have there. Again, watch for rattlesnakes. Then we headed over towards Scotts Bluff. This is the original Oregon Trail went on what is now Robideau Road. Again, we're on a dirt road, open rangeland, so there's always cattle in the way or cattle staring at you, wondering what you're doing. Scotts Bluff is back in the distance. A man named Robideau had a trading post on Robideau Road on the Oregon Trail to supply the immigrants. So they've recreated the trading post here. You can go inside. There's just, a few tools and things hanging on the walls there. Over to Scotts Bluff, because as the years went on, the Oregon Trail came closer in front of Scotts Bluff. Top of the bluff. It's a beautiful view up there. You can walk around and see 360 degrees around. Is looking down from the bluff. The curved road is the road up to the top. You can see how it's carved through the rock there. And then that's the visitor center down at the bottom there. And then the road in front of the visitor center was the later Oregon Trail. When it came through here, they called this Mitchell Pass. And this was also here is Mitchell Pass, the Oregon Trail. By the way, the immigrants, some of them, they kept talking in their diaries about passing through the Badlands, and I didn't really understand what they meant because it's like, well, we're not in South Dakota. And then I realized that this was a generic term for them. When they saw a lot of rocky formations, they called it Badlands. Also, as they passed through the plains and the high plains, they called this the Great American Desert because they saw no reason to stop here. There was nothing you could do here. So unlike today where farmers farm here because of irrigation, back in the day, this was pretty much considered a wasteland. We crossed into Wyoming, came to Fort Laramie, and Fort Laramie began as a fur trading fort and then became the largest military post on the northern plains to supply and protect the immigrants. By now, we've traveled 650 miles. We're a third of the way there. This is where the edge of the western plains begins to lift towards the slopes of the Rockies. And Fort Laramie, as I said, began as a trading fort. So at that time in the early 40s, 1840s, there were no military buildings here. And then it became a military post. And some of the buildings have been restored. Some of the buildings are in ruins, and some of the buildings you can just see some of the foundation. Thousands of people would pass by here, like 4,000 or 5,000 people in, a summer would pass by here. So this was a very busy place. West of Fort Laramie on this dirt road, again, we're looking for landmarks. There's no road signs here. You have to look for landmarks that the National Park Service tells you about so you know where you're turning. We came to the grave of Mary Holmesley. Mary had a husband, 2 daughters, a newborn baby boy. She and her baby were stricken with measles. They were both thrown in the river while crossing, and Mary died here the next day. Her baby died a few weeks later. So they did put a little stone for Mary, and in 1925, some cowboys found the stone. So they told the landowner about it, and it's pretty neat because the following Memorial Day, well, they had contacted Mary's daughter. Mary's daughter knew that her mother was buried somewhere in Wyoming. But the following Memorial Day, they had a service, and they created this monument to encase the little stone that she had, and they had about 500 people attend this service for her. Many people are buried in the middle of the trail so wolves won't dig up the body, and sometimes people who aren't dead yet are just abandoned and left to die along the way because they can't keep up. West of Fort Laramie, we came to Old Bedlam ruts. In the bottom left, you can see some indentations in the land, and then some wagon swales in the larger picture. This was labeled Oregon and Mormon trails, but the California Trail would have been here also. West of there, we came to Register Cliff. This is a large cliff. This was a campsite right on the Platte River where there's a large rock. People are carving their names, the dates, where they came from. So the top right, you can see Mansfield, Ohio. In the bottom right, you can see a graveyard. Again, they're burying their dead as they stop. Just a little bit west of there is Guernsey ruts or Oregon Trail ruts. These are some of my favorite ruts on the Oregon Trail. Here, because of the terrain, they would follow each other in a line. Sorry. In the land where they're coming down towards the Platte River there. And then some of the diaries talk about Natural Bridge. They camped maybe up to a mile away and they would hike over to Natural Bridge. So we came to Natural Bridge, climbed up on the bridge. It's pretty cool up there. You can see, all around there's really pretty rocks in the area, rock formations. When they saw Laramie Peak, they often became apprehensive, wondering what it was going to be like to cross the mountains as they headed west. West of there, near Glen Rock, Wyoming, we came to where 3-year-old little Ada McGill died of dysentery in 1864. She was buried in her Sunday best calico dress, and her body was found in 1912 at the construction of a highway and moved 30 feet off the side of the road. And then they made the stone for her, and then they also erected an Oregon Trail marker by the state of Wyoming. Then in Casper, we came to the National Historic Trails Interpretive Center. This is a fantastic museum. This is run by the Bureau of Land Management. It's free because this is your tax dollars at work. So there's lots of things going on here, lots of things about all the different people who crossed over the trails. I was most interested in a couple of things, but first I have to point out my brother-in-law at the top left. I had to include that because it's just kind of humorous. That's my brother-in-law Dan pulling a Mormon handcart. So the Mormon story is a whole nother story, but for whatever reason they thought it was a good idea to save money and have these hand carts, and it was actually a disaster and a lot of people died, but that's another whole story. So I was interested in calculating the miles because many of the diaries, they talk about exactly how many miles they went each day, and I didn't understand, how do they know how many miles they go? And then I read that one thing they did was they would tie a rag to the wheel and they would have a kid count how many revolutions the wheel made, and they knew how many made a mile. Well, you know, we all know kids. Like, how accurate was that? Like, I don't even think I could accurately keep my attention on that. So then this talked about how the Mormons invented basically this odometer for a wagon. Now, I know the Mormons used it. Whether other people used it, I don't know. It didn't really say. And then the other thing of interest was the accidents being the second greatest killer on the trail. I knew that illness was the number one, but many of the diaries talk about drownings that took place fording the rivers, and also kids falling out of wagons and being crushed by them. So, you know, that kind of backed up what I had read in the diaries. And then there were, you know, other accidents, gunshots, and that type of thing. Mr. Harvey's young little boy, Richard, 8 years old, went to get in the wagon and fell from the tongue. The wheels run over him and mashed his head and kill him stone dead. He never moved. Absalom Hardin, 1847. We also visited the recreated Fort Casper, and here I was most interested in seeing where the Mormon ferry was. So they have a museum here. You could go through the fort buildings. But Brigham Young constructed a ferry near here for the Mormons to cross, and then he had men remain there to operate it as a business. So on the bottom right, there was a painting in the museum showing what that ferry would have looked like with the ropes strung across the river and then the rafts. If they hadn't already crossed the Platte River, they would cross it here at Bessemer Bend or Red Buttes crossing of the Platte. And you can see the Red Buttes in the distance back there. So here they'd followed the Platte River for 500 miles. Here they left it to travel 3 days without a river to meet the Sweetwater River near Independence Rock. So typically they would stop around 6 o'clock. It wasn't set in stone. If it was hot and they rested more during the day, then they might travel more into the night. When they stopped, the kids would help collect firewood or more likely buffalo chips as they headed west. Men would secure the animals and make repairs. The women would cook. They might have beans, rice, bread, bacon, dried fruit, milk, coffee. They made pie. Like, I only make pie like twice a year, but they made pie. And then they would clean up, and if things were going well, just like on Wagon Train, they might have a campfire and sing and dance. But sometimes somebody was ill or dying, somebody was giving birth or just had given birth. I cannot imagine giving birth and having a newborn on the Oregon Trail, but it happened a lot. They would get up before dawn, they would eat, pack up, get on the trail. They stopped somewhere around noon, hopefully a place where they could get grass and water for their animals and give them some rest. Sometimes they would lay over on Sundays to wash their clothes and bake, but as time went on, they realized they were getting behind, so they would stop doing that. So from you can take the 33-mile backcountry route on the Oregon Trail Road towards Independence Rock. This is my favorite road on the Oregon Trail. I know I say my favorite this, my favorite that, but this is my favorite road. So this is open rangeland. Underneath it, on the left or on the right. So here on the left photograph, you can see an old Oregon Trail marker, and then on the right, you can see some indentations in the dirt there. Those rocks going across there, of course, have been named, and one of the names is Avenue of Rocks. Another view on the Oregon Trail Road, and you can see there's not much there, but it's beautiful. Here are some swales on the left side of the Oregon Trail Road marked by the Oregon-California Trail Association. They are the #1 preservation organization to preserve the trails. And I'm a member of them. They have a fantastic website. They do a lot of research before they put any of their trail marker signs here. And again, they also try to preserve the trail, which is always, there's always trails that are in danger. I thought it was cool that my GPS said I was on the Oregon Trail because I was on the Oregon. This is Willow Springs on the Oregon Trail Road. There wasn't a lot of water when we were there, but you could see how there could be water there. So they could stop and rest here and get water. And then they came up Prospect Hill. This was about a 400-foot climb for them. Beautiful view. Here's some ruts marked going up the hill. And here's some more ruts. I pray for strength to raise our precious children, and oh, may no one ever suffer the anguish that's breaking my heart, the agony of parting from that grave, to go and leave him on that hillside where I shall never see it more. Mary Ringo, 1864, who lost her husband before passing here. So imagine what that was like to be heading out to Oregon and you lose your spouse and you really don't know what you're going to do when you get there. So they came to Independence Rock. There are ruts, marked ruts near Independence Rock. This was a popular campsite on the river. Here they met the Sweetwater River. And there's controversy over who named it, but the name Independence Rock meant something to the immigrants, and that is that you should be here by the 4th of July if you were going to safely make it through the mountains before the snow. You can climb Independence Rock. There's a guy up there at the top. I did not climb Independence Rock. They warn you to watch for rattlesnakes. And of course, where there's rocks, people are carving names, or sometimes they would use axle grease. I didn't see a lot of carvings here, but I did take this photograph. I went around the back of the rock, and that's where you can see the Sweetwater River. So the Sweetwater it's kind of just like a stream. It's calling it a river is a stretch. A couple miles down the road is where the Sweetwater River runs through Devil's Gate. And some of the diaries talk about kids, especially if they had some time, they would go play here in the river between the rocks here. Today, this is owned by the Mormons. It's not called Devil's Gate, it's called Martin's Cove. They have a museum a little bit left of here. This is their property. Some people don't like how the Mormons have kind of taken over this and made it their own story because it was more than just their story, but that's just what the controversy is. I'm not giving my opinion one way or another on that. So then here you can see Split Rock. We could see Split Rock for miles away, and here Split Rock looks kind of low, but we did see it higher up, and this was kind of a guide on which way they needed to aim. This is a close-up picture of Split Rock, and you can see the pretty vegetation here. So we were on our way to South Pass. We were coming around this bend here. I looked to the right, and I saw this beautiful view. So thankfully, there was a pullout here where you could park and take some pictures. This was beautiful. This was called Red Canyon. It's not on the Oregon Trail road, but it's near the Oregon Trail. So then we took Oregon Butte Road to South Pass. The Sweetwater River would have had to been crossed up to 9 times before the trail crosses over the Continental Pass. And this is South Pass. The National Park Service says there are ruts and ruts modified by modern traffic, which we were on the ruts on the right, which is pretty much just a trail now. Without South Pass, the history of Western expansion would be very different, and some suggest we would not be one nation, that the Pacific Northwest would have been claimed by the British, and the Southwest would have remained part of Mexico. So the name South Pass distinguishes it from the northern Bitterroot route through the Rockies made by Lewis and Clark. This was used by Native Americans for millennia, and in 1812, a Native American mentioned it to a fur trader, and then it was kind of lost because of the War of 1812, but a few years later, people found out about it, white men found out about it. So here, this is a 20-mile wide pass, and so wagons would spread out. They wouldn't follow each other in a line. Here they crossed over the Continental Divide, and some of the diaries talk about being disappointed because they're crossing over the Continental Divide. The waters now flow to the Pacific, and all it is this gradual slope up. Here in the middle of South Pass are 2 markers, one to Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spaulding, the first white women to cross the pass in 1836. And then on the right is a Meeker marker, and I'm going to talk about Ezra Meeker in a bit. Here's a marker. This is looking east. Both times I've been at South Pass in the afternoon, so a picture looking west didn't look very good. The marker there, one side says Oregon Trail, California Trail, Mormon Trail, and Pony Express. This is a picture of South Pass farther west from there. From that road trail that we were on, you could continue, but they said you really should only continue if you have an off-road vehicle, which I had my Hyundai Elantra the first time and a Highlander the second time. So you can see what the terrain looks like here. It's beautiful. Like, I think about South Pass at home in Ohio a lot. But as they traveled west, the animals began to suffer from lack of food and water and from exhaustion. And so many animals died. The diaries talk of the stench from rotting carcasses. And so they began to throw the contents of their wagon out on the side of the trail. So things that were initially so valuable back in Independence, like grandma's dishes, they just went by the side of the road. And then there were actually scavengers who would pick those things up and they would take it back east and sell them. So because of the dryness of the climate here, the wood in the wagons would dry out and contract. Wagon wheels broke, axles broke. They carried spare parts, but sometimes the wagons just had to be abandoned. So here in the middle of South Pass, you are in the middle of nowhere. There's no cell service. You don't see any homes for like 20 miles. There is a highway. You would see an occasional car on the highway. But after a couple hours, we came to Farson, Wyoming, home of the Big Cone. So if you're from All Glaze County area, this Farson's about the size of Moulton, maybe. If you get there, you got to have a big cone. And Rinker Buck wrote in his book about his adventures in Farson. Southwest to Fort Bridger, the way the old trail went. Jim Bridger was a mountain man, a trapper, a guide. He established Fort Bridger in 1843 to service the immigrant traffic. And he was also the man who assured the Donner Party that the Hastings Cutoff was a fine level road with plenty of grass and water, because he wanted people. The Hastings Cutoff went right by his fort, and he would make money if they came by his fort. Northwest went into Idaho, came to Big Hill. Here, immigrants had to lock their wagons and lower them using chains and ropes. This was private property. You could only view it from the road. There was an interpretive panel there showing what it would look like coming down the hill here. Many of the diaries mention the rotten eggs smell at Sulphur Springs and drinking the refreshing water at Soda Springs. So we stopped at Sulphur Springs and I hiked and hiked and hiked and hiked looking for something. And then I smelled it, the rotten egg smell. And I didn't really see the spring, but I saw this and I took a picture of this. My shoes were just white with this stuff. Then we went into the town of Soda Springs. They have one of the springs encased in concrete, and they encourage you to take a drink. So I had an empty iced tea cup from McDonald's in the car, and even though there were coins at the bottom, which totally grossed me out, I thought I'm going to take a drink. And so I did, and it tasted like Alka-Seltzer. It was nasty. So these springs have bicarbonate of soda, which is like baking soda. And in Wyoming and Idaho, there were many of these poison sloughs with this, and many animals died because they would get there and they would drink too much of this water and it would kill them. We came to Massacre Rock State Park near American Falls, Idaho, and we were there on a Sunday morning, so the museum was closed, but it had some outside information and some trail ruts marked. You can see it was right on the Snake River. And then it said on this big photo on the right that straight ahead here near that mountain is where the Oregon and California Trail split typically. And so right when I was taking this photograph, this bird flew right there just to help me mark the split in the trail there. This is called Massacre Rock because there were some immigrant Native American skirmishes in the area, but only 9 people died. So massacre is a little bit of a stretch. Then we came to Register Rock. This was a popular campsite because of the creek nearby. I just took a photo close up of the rock. This rock is only about, I don't know, 15 feet wide. It's like a hump. And you can see people are carving their names and the date. And then near there is our Milner ruts. This was on the Snake River. There were marked ruts, and then there were interpretive exhibits also. Three Island Crossing in Idaho was the most important and the most difficult river crossing in Idaho. Crossing the Snake River was always dangerous, but when the water was low enough, everyone crossed who could to take advantage of the more favorable northern route to Fort Boise. But during the high water, most of the immigrants were forced to travel along the south alternate route into Oregon, and it was dry and sandy and dusty, and it was a trail that wore out man and beast alike. Actually, the northern route was hot and dusty as well. So on the left, I'm on the hill looking down at the three islands, and then on the right, the three islands are on the right, and there's the hill that I was on, and you could see ruts at the top of the hill and coming down the hill. We came to Bonneville Point overlooking Boise, which was Fort Boise. This again is where they were traveling at the top of ridges. The expressway was down in the valley going into Boise, and here was the Oregon Trail here at the top. So I need to give a shout out to Ezra Meeker. Ezra immigrated to the Oregon Territory in 1852, and he settled in what's now Washington State. His home is actually a museum there. He recognized the historical significance of the trail, and he dedicated the last 25 years of his life to preserving that trail. He made the trip back several times, including in a wagon at the age of 79 in 1907. And he placed these Meeker markers along the trail like you saw at South Pass. He also encouraged other communities to mark the trail. He testified before Congress. He met with Teddy Roosevelt and Calvin Coolidge, and without him, there probably would be no Oregon Trail preserved. To Oregon and came to Farewell Bend State Park, and here they said goodbye to the Snake River on their way across the Columbia Plateau to the Columbia River. So they hadn't really been following the Snake River, I don't think that closely from the way the map looks. And then it talked about how the trail's been so dry and dusty, and many of the oxen were exhausted, some were dying. So they faced a life-threatening dilemma. Are you going to press on and risk losing your team to exhaustion, or are you going to stop and risk losing them, risk them dying of thirst? Then we came through the Burnt River Canyon, or also called Old Oregon Trail Highway. And because this is a very narrow canyon, this highway, I-84, overlies much of the trail. Sometimes you would see on the right like a little sign that said Old Oregon Trail Road. But back in, today we have this modern equipment that makes these highways. Back in the day, they would sometimes be at the bottom of a creek, or they would be on the side of a mountain, and it would require 2 men riding on the side to keep the wagon upright. We came to the Oregon Trail Interpretive Center near Baker City, Oregon. It's up on a high hill. Down in the valley are marked ruts. This is where they want to put some high-powered, high-tension power lines right across this view here. And so the Oregon-California Trail Association and lots of other organizations and individuals are fighting this. They don't want the power lines to go right there. It's going to ruin the Oregon Trail here, which, you can never bring that back. And they also say that soon those would be obsolete. When they encountered the Blue Mountains, most of the immigrants were already weary and exhausted. Edward Parrish in 1844 described it as the worst road yet. Abigail Jane Scott in 1852 described a descent in the Blue Mountains as down the most dangerous looking place we had yet come. Sometimes they needed 22 oxen to pull one wagon up the mountain, and then they would use chains and ropes to lower them, and it was very difficult. They also had difficulty rounding up their animals in the forest. So here in the Blue Mountains, there were lots of discarded supplies and a lot of people died. So this is Blue Mountain Crossing. I like how it said on the right 2-mile-per-hour wagon speed. On the left is the Blue Mountain Crossing photograph that I took, and then on the right is the interpretive panel showing what it would have looked like back in the day. Here are a set of swales at the top of the pass. Some of them have trees growing in them now. And then the wagon on the right, we met a park host who he and his wife stay there in the summertime. They're from Arizona, but they stay here. And he was very informative about the trail in this area. And we were told that this wagon was created entirely of discarded wagon parts. So as people would lose parts of their wagons or abandon wagons, then somebody at some time made this wagon with the parts. Here at Escalpte Creek Overlook, the National Park Service points out how you can see why early immigrants used Native American guides to pilot through the Blue Mountains, because each one of these little crevices has, it's a deep crevice with these tall pine trees growing in. It would be a disaster to take a wagon train through here if you don't know where you're going. We came to Immigrant Springs on the Columbia Plateau in eastern Oregon. It's very dry here. I don't know why they called it Immigrant Springs. I didn't see a spring. I walked a long time in 95-degree heat to try to find the ruts here, and then I had to walk all the way back. And here are the ruts. It does. So then we came to where the Deschutes River crosses into the Columbia River. And today both of these rivers look tame because they're dammed up. But both of these were dangerous rivers. They had large rocks and very rapid currents. The Deschutes River, people would often hire Native Americans to assist them in crossing over the river. And then they had two choices. They could float down the Columbia, or they could take the Barlow Road through the Cascade Mountains. So the Columbia was very fast, had many rapids, many people drowned. Then they had to drive their cattle along the shore. I read that some people walked along the shore. I'm not really sure how many people were on rafts and how many people were walking, but they would have to portage then when they came to the rapids. This was of the Columbia River at the Columbia River Gorge Interpretive Center Museum of what the Columbia River would have looked like back in the day. So we took the Barlow Road. This is the beginning of the Barlow Road, the view of Mount Hood heading into the Barlow Road was built in 1845 to 1846 by Samuel Barlow. This was a toll road, so you had to pay ahead of time. And many people at the end of it were swearing and said they never would have paid ahead of time had they known what this road was really like. This is part of the Barlow Road in the Cascade Mountains. This is beautiful here. You know, looks like a really nice road. This was near a campground, actually. Here is Pioneer Woman's grave on the Barlow Road. Her body was found here when they put in the road, paved the road, and her body was moved to the side. And today people leave her rocks and little trinkets. And this is right near Mount Hood. This is Trillium Lake. It's not on the Oregon Trail, but it's near the Oregon Trail. And I just had to take a picture and include it so you could see how beautiful it is there in the Cascades. So then they came to Laurel Hill, and Laurel Hill was a nightmare. This was the most treacherous part of the trail. It had a 60-degree slope. They used chains to lock their wagons and then ropes, and then would lower them a little bit and retie and then lower it a little more. They also would cut down trees and pull the trees behind them, drag it behind them to slow them down, which of course was fine for you, but then it ruined the road for other people coming behind you. So there were a total of 7 chutes made over the period of years. And I to get a good picture of this. The highway was right there in the way. People were going 80 miles an hour on this road, so I couldn't like just leisurely walk over there and take the other side. Photo of a Laurel Hill chute, and you can see the indentations, the swales there on the rocks. So look at that slope there and then out in the distance, and imagine taking a wagon through here. So this is a photo. You can see Mount Hood over on the right in the background, and then the overlook here. This is John's Rudd viewpoint. They point out how they would follow what's called Devil's Backbone here, which was a ridge again. We came to the end of the Oregon Trail in Oregon City. They had a museum there. It talked about what the immigrants did when they got there to Oregon. Some of them claimed land, some of them started businesses, you know, the typical things that people do when they get to a new area. My sweet son-in-law had this made for me, and this hangs in my house. I love this because I am a rut nut. So thank you for joining me on my journey. I hope you learned something or found it interesting. I would definitely encourage you to take the trip. A lot of people I met were they would do one state a summer, you know, once we can all travel again. So it's a really fascinating trip to take, and it's just beautiful. You see so much of the West. I just loved it. So thanks for joining me. Hope you enjoyed it.